Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Caitlin Trudeau. I'm a Senior Research Associate at Climate Central. And while I'll be presenting today, I wanted to acknowledge my co-presenter, Jocelyn Azada, who really has led this project and is unable to make it today as she's been dealing with the impacts of Hurricane Milton. So I really just wanted to acknowledge her, and also, I'm sure many people in Florida right now are dealing with a lot. So we really appreciate your time and attention. I wanted to start things off by first acknowledging the remarkable moment we're living in. The rate of warming we've experienced over the past 170 or so years is something humans have never really experienced before. 2023 was the hottest year on record, and 2024 is on track to meet or exceed it. Likely the most obvious and widely felt consequence of all this warming is the increase in frequency and severity of certain types of extreme weather. These are unnatural disasters, and we very likely would not be experiencing these same storms at the same frequencies and intensities without all the carbon pollution we've emitted into the atmosphere. Since 1980, the U.S. has experienced nearly 400 weather and climate disasters, each costing at least $1 billion. And this is actually an undercount because extreme heat events aren't included in this data set. That being said, every state in our country has been impacted by at least one of these extremely costly and destructive disasters. Collectively, they've cost Americans more than $2.8 trillion and over 16,000 lives. 2003 saw a record-breaking $28 billion disasters, and the average number of days between these events has reduced significantly from about 82 days in the 1980s to only 12 days now, reducing our capacity to respond, recover, and prepare for the next event. A recent survey conducted by Yale Center for Climate Communication found that two-thirds of Americans think global warming is affecting weather, including more than one-third who think it's affecting weather a lot. The survey also found that 56% of Americans think extreme weather poses either a high or moderate risk to their community over the next 10 years. But overall, two-thirds of Americans say they're at least moderately worried about global warming or climate change. People understand that something's going on, they understand there's some connection to the weather, but they're not exactly sure what that connection is or what it means for them, their families, or their communities. Local TV meteorologists have been identified as one of America's most trusted groups of messengers. By leveraging the trust of their communities, their regular audience reach, and their communication skills, TV meteorologists are uniquely positioned to make climate change science more accessible and actionable for the public. And there's research to back this up. Studies have found people who watch local weather segments with climate information were more likely to understand, accept, and be concerned about climate change compared to those who watched regular weather reports. This effect was consistent across political ideologies, which indicates that trusted local communicators, like local TV broadcasters, can help bridge the ideological divide and enhance public engagement with important issues. And it was this research that inspired our report. Nielsen and Climate Central partnered to understand if, when, and how local TV broadcasters connect the dots between extreme weather and climate change. While similar work has been done looking at national news, this is, to our knowledge, the first analysis of climate contextualization in local news at a national scale. Unlike related studies, this report has a large focus on the audience, which we found was absolutely key to understanding the real-world value and impact of this kind of information. Central to our analysis is a concept called climate contextualization, and this term really refers to any information that helps place a given extreme weather event in the broader context of climate change. And this can take many forms, including climate statistics or trends, interviews with experts, related findings from peer-reviewed research, or discussion of local impacts and solutions. The depth of contextualization may vary and can be either direct or indirect. We did not consider a segment to include climate contextualization if the speaker presented factually incorrect or intentionally misleading information, or solely presented personal opinion. Segments that only mentioned climate change in passing or as part of a teaser or segment promotion were not considered. There were four primary questions we set out to answer with this study. First, we wanted to understand if local TV broadcasters were accurately connecting the dots between extreme weather and climate change. it may not always be appropriate to do so. So we first wanted to understand, is this happening when it's appropriate? Second, we wanted to understand how many people are actually watching these segments. What's the real world impact of these segments? And what's their reach? We also wanted to understand if this climate contextualization would vary based on the different type of extreme weather. And we wanted to understand if the broadcasters were simply stating a connection or if they went further and discussed event related impacts, things that would affect people's daily lives. Our first step was to identify which segments we wanted to study. And then we looked at the appropriate dates, which was basically immediately before, during, and after the peak impact of these storms. And then we needed to define two sets of keywords. The first were event related keywords, things like Hurricane Ian or Tropical Storm Hillary. The second set were climate related keywords, things like climate, science, carbon, and using this information, we searched closed captioning data to identify related local news segments that covered these events. We searched across the big four networks, ABC, CBS, Fox, and NBC, and in the top 50 US media markets by population. And then we reviewed each segment to identify whether there was climate contextualization or any kind of impact related messaging. We also wanted to calculate the total viewership of all these contextualized segments to better understand the total reach and value of this kind of information. One of the most important considerations when selecting events was the presence of robust scientific evidence showing this kind of extreme weather was actually connected to climate change. We also wanted to get a mix of geography and look at different types of extreme weather. And we, of course, were limited by things like data availability and other resource restrictions like time. The graphic to the right is adapted from the most recent IPCC report and highlights four types of extreme weather for which we have high confidence that humans are making these events either more likely or more extreme. So, tropical cyclones or hurricanes, we know that they are associated with more rainfall. Hot and dry events, sometimes called combination or fire weather events, those are happening more often and they're more intense. Heavy rainfall events are becoming more common and they're more intense as well. And then we have extreme heat waves a lot more often and they are much more intense. So those are the four categories, four different types of extreme weather we decided to focus on. So here are our four events. For our tropical cyclone or hurricane event, we chose Hurricane Ian in September of 2022. For our combination hot and dry event, we chose the Canadian wildfires in June of 2023. Again, it's not really the fires we're looking at, it's the hot and dry conditions that exacerbated the wildfires or fire weather specifically. For our extreme heat event, we chose the record breaking 31-day streak of temperatures above 110 degrees in Phoenix last July. And for our heavy rainfall event, we chose Tropical Storm Hillary that affected the West Coast last August. It started out as a hurricane, but we really focused on it the time that it was over land and causing heavy downpours as a tropical storm. I'm going to give a quick overview of our key findings and then go through each one a little more in detail. But the first is that contextualized segments have high reach and impact. Millions of people watch these segments, and it wasn't just something that aired in the local area where the event was happening. We found contextualized segments across the entire country. Second, we found that climate contextualization was most common in the events that were most directly related to heat. So the heat wave event, the hot and dry event, as compared to heavy rainfall or hurricanes. And third, almost all of the contextualized segments mentioned some kind of hazardous impact. There was some kind of related message as to why people should care, what this really means for you and your life. And then the last one was that a particularly useful communication tool were rapid attribution analyses. These were used often by local broadcasters to help communicate to the public how these events are connected to human-caused climate change. So as I mentioned, the contextualized segments had really high reach and impact. More than 17 million people watched these contextualized segments. and we found them in every one of the 50 markets that we looked at. And also, it wasn't just that people were tuning into TV. We found that audiences really surged across different kinds of media. There were massive surges in TV, radio, and streaming apps as well. So we found climate contextualization was most common in segments related to extreme heat. 13% of all Phoenix-related segments had climate contextualization in them. The second most was with the Canadian wildfires, and we found 8% of those event-related segments included some kind of climate context. Tropical Storm Hillary had, a bit fewer at 3%, and Hurricane Ian had 2%. And one thing that I will mention that's important here to remember is the heavy rainfall event and the hurricane event. Um, those had a significantly higher number of event-related segments. And when you think about why, those kinds of events are being updated hourly. So people are getting a new update on the projected path of these storms, the impacted areas, messages from emergency services. So there are far more event-related segments in those two categories, which is largely why there is a smaller number of segments. But it's also important to remember that not, you know, these kinds of events, it is uh, the priority of local broadcasters to keep their audiences safe and informed. And that really should be the priority. This is not a time to kind of go off on tangents or, talk about other things. Really, people have limited time, limited attention, and they need to know where they need to go or what they need to do to keep them and their families safe. So it really makes sense that we see a smaller percentage of contextualization for those events compared to the other events, which were more prolonged, I guess. The extreme heat event lasted for a month, and the wildfire event was really a hot and dry event, and that also caused air quality impacts and extended far longer than either the tropical storm or the hurricane. Our third key finding was that nearly every segment with climate context included some kind of impact related message. Most common were impacts related to health and safety, which won't be surprising to anyone. But there were also a lot of segments that included impacts on the economy. There were a lot of segments that talked about the impacts on vulnerable communities or impacts on travel or power supply. We found examples of these kinds of impact related messages across all four events. And while health and safety was the most common across the board, there were some events that had some interesting patterns. The hot and dry event, the Canadian wildfires, actually had a pretty good mix of different types of impact related messages. It wasn't just related to health and safety, wasn't just about the impact of smoke on your lungs. It was a lot about the economy, the impact of how outdoor sporting events had to be canceled, Broadway shows were canceled, flights were canceled. And with the extreme heat event in Phoenix, we found a lot of examples related to impacts on vulnerable communities. Of course, talking about people who are elderly, people who are really young, but also people who are unhoused and people who work outdoors, people with pets. These are all different kinds of examples we found of different broadcasters highlighting the impacts on vulnerable communities there in Phoenix. And our last key finding was that rapid attribution studies and related attribution tools really increased the amount of contextualization that we found around the day or the day after these events. A couple of these examples: during the Phoenix heat streak, the World Weather Attribution Group released a study that found that July heat experienced across the Southwest would have been virtually impossible without human-caused climate change. This study was cited over and over and over again by all different kinds of outlets all over the country. Similarly, there was a rapid attribution study about Hurricane Ian from Stony Brook University and the Berkeley Lawrence Laboratory that found Hurricane Ian was at least 10 to 12% wetter due to human-caused climate change. They later, I think a year later, updated that study with a little more time and found it was about 18% wetter. Another example was Climate Central's Climate Shift Index. It's a daily temperature attribution tool. You can use a map to search anywhere in the world on any day and see how much more or less likely climate change has made your temperatures. So, for example, during this time, people could search for Phoenix, and there were many days where the climate change index was a 5, which meant that climate change made temperatures that day at least 5 times more likely. So, these were all examples of studies and tools that broadcasters used to help communicate how these events are connected to climate change. Going back to that recent survey conducted by Yale and George Mason University, they surveyed Americans and they asked them about all different kinds of environmental problems and asked them if they thought that global warming is affecting them in the United States. And while they asked about many more than these four, I just wanted to kind of highlight these results. So 74% of Americans think that global warming is affecting extreme heat, at least some or a lot. That number is 73% for wildfires, 68% for both flooding and hurricanes. And the reason I bring this up is because this pattern of what people believe is actually pretty similar to the pattern of that we found when we looked at the percentage of contextualized segments. And to be clear, I'm not suggesting that local TV segments are the only thing impacting people's beliefs about what is or is not affected by climate change. But I think there is a relationship here between how often people are hearing about these connections from their trusted messengers and how that really translates into the real world, how that translates into people's beliefs and their attitudes about these connections, whether they exist, what they can do about them, these kinds of things. And so I think the more the local broadcasters connect these dots for their audiences, the more we will see that translate into the real world. And of course, very complex. There's probably many, many things at play here, but I think that it is one piece of the puzzle. That being said, there's still a lot of work to do here. When you ask Americans how often they hear about global warming in the media, only 32% say that they hear about it in the media at least once a week. So this is still not something that is discussed very often in many parts of our country. You can see that map. There is a lot of work to be done. People still have a lot of questions, and local broadcasters can play a pretty central role in helping empower their audiences to make more informed decisions, help keep themselves, their families, and their communities safe during these times of extreme weather. Now, seeing as how this is Florida Climate Week, I wanted to give a little more detail to the only event we looked at in Florida, which was Hurricane Ian. So for this event, we focused on the time really right before landfall in Florida and about a day or so after. We identified a total of 8,113 event-related segments. Again, these are local news segments that aired on the Big Four networks and in one of the top 50 US media markets. And out of over 8,000 event-related segments, only 2% included climate contextualization. And as I mentioned previously, this is likely because of the type of event Hurricane Ian was. These events often have the highest number of event-related segments because they are constantly changing. They're very dynamic, and there are updates to the forecast issued every 3-4 hours. So local media as well as national media, they are constantly discussing, constantly updating the public, giving them the most up-to-date forecast to really focus on keeping people safe. And that is and should be the priority of local broadcasters during these times, is giving the public the information they need to stay safe. And so I don't think we would expect to see a lot of discussion related to what's causing this during the time of the extreme event. Afterwards, probably, but people are really doing their jobs and focusing on safety. And out of those 192 contextualized segments, 89% directly referenced the term climate change. So there were by far direct references to climate change compared to indirect references such as, as temperatures rise in a warmer world, those kinds of things. but only 1% of contextualized segments described climate change as human caused or human induced. But 60% of the contextualized segments really took it a step further, and they gave at least one example of how climate change is impacting storms like Hurricane Ian. So they gave examples like warm ocean waters are fuel for hurricanes, and we're seeing that warmer oceans with climate change, or warmer air can hold more water. So as we see more climate change, we know that we're going to see heavier downpours more frequently. Some talked about how with sea level rise, that actually exacerbates storm surges, things like that. So there were a lot of examples of local broadcasters really trying to help their audiences not only understand that climate change is affecting storms like Hurricane Ian, but really understand the how of it. This chart shows the daily segments that mentioned Hurricane Ian over this time period and the number that were contextualized versus not contextualized. So you can see that really leading up to and during the main part of Hurricane Ian, those first 4 days, is when we really saw a huge number of event-related segments. And again, this is related to the updated forecasts and alerts from emergency management officials. And then you can see after Hurricane Ian passed over Florida, went back out into the Atlantic, you see the number of event-related segments really dropped. And then after that, you can see the percentage of contextualization actually jumped back up after the event had passed a little bit. People had a little more time. People weren't so focused on updating people on the updated path, the affected areas. There was a little more breathing room to really take it a little step further and discuss the connections there. Going back to the impact-related messaging, Hurricane Ian segments most commonly discussed health and safety impacts, which again is not surprising, but there were also a lot of segments that talked about power supplies and demand. They talked about, of course, a lot of, millions of people lost power, but also they had some solution messaging as well. There was discussion about electric cars, and they gave an example of this electric vehicle. It was a truck that could be used to power your home for at least 10 days after a hurricane, which was really interesting. There were also a lot of impacts related to the economy, to how these events were impacting people's finances. And then, of course, vulnerable communities. For Hurricane Ian, there was a lot of examples related to people who lived on barrier islands, also people who were elderly, people who had limited mobility, but also first responders were really vulnerable communities as well. People with pets, they talked a lot about examples like people, at zoos and the animals that are left out during these kinds of storms and can't really evacuate in the same way that humans can. When looking at the audience of these contextualized segments, we found that local TV audiences really surged compared to weeks previously. So, in Orlando during Hurricane Ian and Tampa, audiences increased by over 100% compared to the week before. So, a lot of people tuning in those two markets during Hurricane Ian. And as I previously mentioned, it wasn't just local TV. There were also huge increases across local streaming apps. So people 2 years old and above, the Orlando market saw a 244% increase compared to the week previously. Looking at the same thing in Orlando for people 25 to 54, there was an even larger increase, 395% increase in streaming local news streaming apps compared to the week before. So wrapping this up with some final thoughts, local broadcasters really are following the science. They're highlighting the ever-growing ways these events are impacting the things that we care about the most. And as climate change continues to exacerbate extreme weather, local broadcasters have a huge opportunity to scale up what's working and help foster a more informed, engaged, and empowered public that's actually equipped to meet this incredible moment we're living in. I also wanted to share some resources for local journalists or broadcasters who are looking for attribution information. Climate Central has a Climate Shift Index global map. It's updated daily. You can look anywhere in the world. and see whether or not climate change has influenced the likelihood of the temperatures you're seeing today. So I really recommend that, csi.climatecentral.org. Similarly, we have a new climate shift index for sea surface temperatures. This is a really amazing tool because you can actually look at different tropical storms, different hurricanes, and see not only how warm ocean temperatures were along their path, but also how much more likely those ocean temperatures were because of human-caused climate change. This example is from Helene. The temperatures that were experienced in the ocean on September 26th in this area had been made at least 300 times more likely due to human-caused climate change. So there are some really significant numbers here, and I really encourage anyone who's interested in this kind of information to please check these out. Again, at csi.climatecentral.org, and for the ocean, csi.climatecentral.org/ocean. And finally, since there, wasn't enough time to get into everything we talked about in the report, we wanted to provide the QR code here that will take you to the full report where you can read all about our findings, and learn a little bit more about what we found. Also, feel free to email either Jocelyn or myself if you have any questions, comments. We'd love to hear from you. And again, thank you so much for your time and attention, especially with what's happening right now in Florida. We really appreciate you taking the time to hear about our work. Thanks so much.